Shalom everyone, you're here again with another episode of Tzor Mikra, and I'm very glad that the listeners are back. I'm also seeing that the number of viewers on YouTube is more or less consistent, and hopefully the numbers will grow. So it'll be very good if people share the recording so other people can hear about it. And we're actually just finished the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshit, and we are actually now in Sefer Shemot, the book of names, referred to as Exodus because one of the main stories here is the Exodus story, but the name itself in Hebrew is Shemot, based on the fact that the second word in this parasha, the first parasha in this book is Ve'ele Shemot Bnei Israel, so it's referred to as Sefer Shemot. There were actually other names ascribed to the different books at different times. Shemot was the one that most people went with, so it's the name most people hear about. There are a lot of interesting things here. One of the first questions that people usually ask is, how do you actually reach 70 people who went down to Egypt? I addressed this at a different parasha, but I'll just to speak about it again because it says in verse 4, sorry, verse 5, Vahi kol nefesh yotzei erech Yaakov shivrim nafesh. It says that all the people who are the descendants of the ones who came out of the thigh. Yerech is a clean way of referring to the reproductive organs. All the people who came out of the thigh of Yaakov, 70 shivim nafesh, 70 people. And we have to remember that 70 is really 7 times 10. And in many different attempts to count the number of people who actually went down to Egypt, the number is probably lower. It's more in the area of the 68, 69. And a lot of people play around with names and try to claim this person, that person. But the fact remains that it's really not 70 people. It's very difficult to find 70 people. There is a midrash, and I've actually been asked about this a couple of times. So I was asked to discuss this in this recording. The 70 people is a, again, as I said, a theophoric number. It's 7 times 10, 7 being a special number, 10 being a special number. But one of the explanations that's given is that Yosef married his own, we call it his own niece, because what they say, the midrash says that the daughter of Yaakov, Dinah, when she was raped by by Shechem ben Hamor, that she became pregnant. But because the child was an illegitimate child, they sent her away. Now, this is obviously a late midrash, but we have to be very careful with midrashim, as I've pointed out as well. But sometimes midrashim can contain historical data. The reason it's one of the reasons I think they came to this conclusion is because Potiphar and Potipharah are basically the same name, and Potiphar is referred to as Saris Paro, and the word Saris is usually a word that's understood at a much later stage, is understood as being someone who's a eunuch. Now, this is not true to this period. The term saris originally meant someone who was a court official, and there actually were two types that we know of. There was the digno sariso, which was the person a person who had a beard, and usually people who were eunuchs were made eunuchs at a young age, which meant the possibility of growing a beard dropped dramatically. And then there was another type which was referred to as something else. I don't remember the term at the moment. It still doesn't mean someone who's a complete eunuch. These were probably people who were court officials that were not old enough to grow a beard, or that maybe the beard was a symbol of status. There's an interesting thing here that might connect to the symbol status through the beard. So they try to explain that she was sent away and she was adopted by Potiphar, and this is why he married his own daughter. Now, this obviously is a very late midrash because there are a lot of motifs here which connect to a very late period. The idea of, first of all, sending away a child, an illegitimate child, is not necessarily something the Israelites would do. This is something that might show up at a much later stage under Greco-Roman influence, because the Greeks and the Romans would send away children to reduce the number of children in a family. Um, Tacitus actually, not only Tacitus, a lot of Greco-Roman historians criticize the Jews for the fact that they actually allowed children to stay in the family, while their custom was to send away as many children as possible to reduce the number of offsprings and inheritors in the family. Um, Jews were known for keeping as many children as possible, and so it doesn't really fit. The idea of Joseph, specifically trying to find Joseph marrying someone from the Jewish people, is again something that's a much later development. It's something which shows up in Judaism after the Persian era, actually during the Persian era, the whole story with Ezra and Nehemiah. So the interpretation here given about the whole story of Yosef and his wife and everything, and trying to prove that it's all 70 people, it doesn't really work out. However, it's possible that 70 people will include an illegitimate child that might have been born from Dinah, and she's not named because she is not a patriarchal descendant of Yaakov, but she was still there. That might be a much more reasonable argument. That because she's the daughter of someone who raped her, she doesn't really have the child doesn't really have a lineage, and therefore, though she is a descendant of Yaakov through the mother, she's not through the father, and this father was an illegitimate father, and therefore she's not counted. But it is 70 people, and there are different ways of playing around with it. In any case, I actually read a very interesting book about a year ago regarding this whole story, the story of Yosef, but also the story of the whole deal with the terminology and the reality here. And I think the name was something Pnina something. And if I remember the name, I'll put it down in the description. But what we find here is that the writer actually goes over stage by stage in the stories from Joseph all the way to the Exodus, and proves that there's an actual historical knowledge of Egypt in these stories that fit specifically this period. Obviously, scholars would try to argue, yeah, this is something they just they created a motif and they studied the Egyptians before they wrote this. This is actually not true. It's very very common. The historical writers before the the time of um, you know people like now names are running away from my brain the moment I need them. But before the classic historians in the fourth, fifth century, like Diodoros and Plutarch and other many names that exist. I mean, there were so many historical writers in this period. People would write things that they hear, rumors that they hear. Even some of these historians, which are considered to be real historians, um, were fed by rumors. Here, there's actually an accuracy. Now, you would think, oh, Egypt is next to the land of Israel, but the knowledge presented here actually requires actually being in Egypt and knowing and seeing with your own eyes what Egypt looks like. And the Egyptians had a control in this region for quite a while, but you wouldn't see the entire scope of Egyptian culture. Therefore, it is actually quite possible that as it's quite possible to us, that the writer here was actually physically in Egypt. So the argument that this was written much, much later obviously doesn't stand, because the knowledge here is quite internal of how Egypt works and what Egypt to some degree looks like. There are a lot of words, like for example, the name Pitom is really Pi Atum, which, according to some of the sources I have at home, is actually means the lands of Atum, and Pitom is just a combination of both words. Um, this knowledge of the fact that there were women that helped give birth, but it says Vayiro la ha'ovnaim. The ovnaim, for many years, people didn't really understand what it was, but now we know that Egyptians in this period had birth stones. There was this seat that a woman would sit on, and they would give birth on this stone. So it says Vereitem ala ovnaim. A lot of much later commentators trying to understand what is the ovnaim, what does it look like, and then we discover no, they actually gave birth on these rocks that were set like seats. So there was a lot of there's a lot of knowledge here of Egypt. There's also a lot of Egyptians word, like for example the word yeol, which is the common word which appears to describe water bodies, bodies of water. Sorry, in Egypt is referred to as yeol, and it's really either iru or irtiru, um, no, itiru. which is an Egyptian word that describes a body of water. So there's a lot of Egyptian words here. There are a lot of Egyptian themes which are very, very clear. The stories here are written under a very, very heavy Egyptian influence. Now, the story about the birth of Moshe, obviously, a lot of people try to say, oh, it's like the story of Sargon I. The stories are not even similar. The stories are not even close. If you actually open up the story of Sargon I, you actually see a completely different story. It is a child who's born to royalty, who's abandoned by his mother because the father wanted to kill him, and he's found by a farmer, and the farmer takes care of him, and then he returns to become king. The only motif that's similar is the idea of the abandonment and putting him in a reed basket. Everything else is completely different. Sargon is not a redeemer. He is not. He is not a savior. He is not presented as a family of Levites or priests. A lot of differences. There are a few similarities which we can refer to as literary motifs or literary tools, but that's because it's a it's a literary tool. It is not it's not the story itself. There's something that has to be understood about this. The fact that we find a similarity in a story doesn't mean that it's a copying from one another. One of the common arguments that I hear a lot is, oh, someone was copying from one another. Everyone was stealing. This word stealing shows up a lot, which is really, really incorrect. If you don't know how the ancient world worked, the fact that you sat down and read a few articles on the internet or you're doing internet research doesn't make you an expert, period. If you ever ask anyone who's an expert in literature, ancient literature, for example, moi, as Yoel Halevi, who's the person whose degree is in history and has to read a lot of historical accounts, a lot of historical books, and a lot of ancient literature, and has done classes in ancient literature, I can tell you one very simple thing, and this comes from scholars that I know, professors of biblical studies and history and literature that I've actually studied under, which I've had discussions with, and they, even as secular people, they say very bluntly there are massive differences between the stories in the Bible and the stories we find in the ancient world. What we find are literature which use similar motifs but have very, very different stories. And this comes from secular scholars who believe document hypothesis and everything, but they admit that the style that people use, especially people from the 60s and 70s and 80s that try to argue against the Tanakh, that these tools are outdated, that they are incorrect, and they use very general ideas to try to prove their points. But the fact remains that when you put the stories side by side, they are extremely different. Moses is presented here as a regular birth in a regular family who is under threat by a royal decree to kill children. This is not a chasing after an individual child that they know who this individual child is and the king is looking for him. This is the king looking for an individual child, but it has nothing to do with inheriting the king's throne. It has nothing to do with threatening the king's throne. Everything is different. There's this small motif here of danger and rescue through putting in a basket and someone finding. But here it's the reverse. The child ends up in the royal family, not in a farmer's home. The child ends up growing in the royal house, not as a farmer. He doesn't rise to power by becoming a great man. He is sent by God to do his deeds, to save his people, not to become king. A lot of differences here, and these differences are important. These are just literary tools which are well known, are well documented, and are used in the Bible as well, which means the Bible is written in a very, very old setting, a style that belongs to the second millennia BC. This is the same period these other stories were written. So these are literary tools. It has nothing to do with stealing from one another, imitating, or anything like that. Just tools. This shows that there was a highly developed sense of literature and a highly developed sense of understanding how to convey a story. That's all it really is. In any case, he runs away to Midyan, and there's this very famous story, this very famous thing that goes around, that there's presumably an Egyptian writing that says that there was a land of Yud He Vav in Midyan. First of all, this reading is not necessarily considered to be correct. Second of all, we don't necessarily know what this means. What is this land of Yud Hey Vav? Okay. The other thing as well is, from what period is this name? Is it possible that this name was given because there were Israelites who lived there for a while, and people knew that there was a group of people who lived there who worshipped a god known as Yud Hey Vav? If the reading is even correct, it's again this attempt to try to show things the opposite of what they actually might be, giving only one interpretation, and that interpretation is deliberately presented in a way that deliberately makes it into something that fits this ideology of the scholars, and no one ever discusses maybe other possibilities. So there are several issues here with this. Could it be the name is read differently? Could it be that the name was given to this region after the time the Israelites were actually there? Could it also be something that would give us information where the real Mount Sinai is, which might prove that it actually is in the land of Midyan, which is, by the way, the most reasonable thing based on the information we have here. The difficulty begins with the fact that the desert area between Midyan and Egypt is known as the Sinai Desert, but it doesn't, or the Sinai Peninsula. It doesn't prove that's where Mount Sinai was. This is something that was invented much, much later. But whatever the case may be, you have to be very, very careful with these interpretations because they're extremely one sided. But if I'm already talking about Yud Hey Vav, let's talk about the name of God. One of the big questions that everyone asks is, how do you pronounce the name of God? Now, don't expect me to pronounce it here, I don't do that. But one of the things that has come up throughout the several years of studying, and especially, knowing pronunciations from a very, very young age, there's this myth. There's this myth that no one knew the name of God before certain individuals did research, and the answer is this is nonsense. Jews in general have always known what were the vowel points used in the Masoretic text and the traditional vowel points used to put in the name of God. There was never every doubt about it. When someone walked up to me and they said, "Oh yeah, someone did research on the name of God. Now we know how it's pronounced," and they said it to me, and I'm like, "What are you talking about? I knew this 30 years ago. There's nothing new about this." But it's been promoted. It's already something else. It's being brought out to people who don't know. But this was nothing new to anyone. Everyone knew this pronunciation. Now, the pronunciation I'm talking about is the one used in the Masoretic text, where under the yud there's a shva, which is mobile shva, which is kind of like a bit of an a very short a, a very short a cholam before the hey, which makes it into a ho. So you have ya or ya, and then you have, if you go based on what the Masoretic say, it's really ya. It's not ya or ye, it's ya. It's a half o sound. You have a hey with a cholam, which is a ho. Then you have the vav. Big famous argument is a vav, a va, or a wa. There's evidence to both sides. It could have been a wa, it could have been a va. There could have been regional accents, and which means it could have been pronounced differently in different areas to this very day. Jews who come from certain areas, old German Hebrew, or Yemenite, or some places in North Africa and Iraq, it's a wa. France, Eastern Europe, other parts of North Africa, other areas of Persia or India, it's a va. Either way, what we see here is that there's an interesting divide here, that some places pronounce as a wa, some places pronounce as a va. There was actually a book written back in '98, I think it was, called Sifteh Kohen, where actually someone went around all the different Jewish communities and wanted to hear what people said. And he said an overwhelming number go wa, but he said there's also a large number that go va. So it can be either way, because there's this rumor that keeps on showing up at my doorstep of we don't want to say va because va is not original. Then I hear the opposite. We don't say wa because wa is not original. There's no such thing as original in languages. Languages develop all the time, so both could have existed simultaneously, or one could be a development of the other. It's unknown. So it's just, that's the reality. And then we have a hey that's pronounced as a va or wa because there's a kamatz, it's a long a, and there's a hey at the end. Now it's possible the hey was pronounced. It might have been va, or it might have been silent. There's been va at the end. But in any case, as you can see, I'm talking more about what the Masoretes pronounce, because um, what happened is that the name that a lot of people in Christianity pronounce, which is the Yah slash 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 we, or we at the end, or Yah and then at the end the way, is a very, very late pronunciation invented by scholars. Now, some people try to connect it maybe to the pronunciation by the Samaritans, which is very the same vowel points as Yafeh, which some scholars do believe that this was one of the titles that would give God, the glorious or the beautiful. And if I'm not mistaken, Saint Jerome actually writes about this. I think it was Saint Jerome writes about this, that the Jews pronounce it um, uh, something in the area of something that sounds a little bit like the pronunciation we find in the Masoretic text. I can't remember what it was now. It's like uh, Yoba, something like that, and then that the Samaritans go Ebe, something like that. Now, the reason it's a be there is because the Samaritans, their vav is pronounced as a b. I actually heard Samaritans. I actually sat down with a Samaritan man several years ago. So there, for example, when they recite the letters on high feast, and they say, I think they go yeah, I, something like that, because the yud is a ya, the hey is usually represents an e, the vav is a b, and the hey last hey is a e as well. Yeah, I be, something like that. They pronounce it, and I don't think it represents vowel points. I think it's just the basic sounds they understand that these letters produce. So I don't, and they specifically say they say shama, which is an Aramaic word for the name. So the Samaritans picked up on this practice of not pronouncing the name. So really, the only group that has an ongoing tradition of at least 1,500 years are the Jewish Masoretes that have a pronunciation attested 50 times in the biblical text. You can go pick up. There are several books about this subject. There's all specifically my friends Nehemiah Gordon and Keith Johnson have done their work on this field. And it seems to be that this is the name. Now, there's another thing that came up, and I know that specifically today's the 30th. I'm recording this on the 30th. I know that Nehemiah Gordon has done a recording with someone from the Bible Lands Museum about Akkadian inscriptions. I actually was one of the people that brought this up first, way, way before everyone else even thought about this. Uh, about a year or two ago, about what the Akkadian can tell us about the pronunciation. And what's interesting is that the theophoric prefixes and suffixes in people's names, like Yehotzadak, or any name that uses the name of God, in the Assyrian inscriptions it appears as Yahu. So, for example, Yirmiyahu, but also names that would use theophoric prefixes like Yehuchal, which is probably pronounced Yehochal, or Yehoshua, and so on. It seems to be that it was all pronounced Yahu. Now, we need to say a few things about vowel points here to fully understand this subject. The vocal shva was originally a vowel point, was actually an actual vowel point, so it was either pronounced whatever vowel point it was. O could have been pronounced also as an U, though we know quite clearly, and people keep on writing to me things with an U sound where we usually pronounce an O sound. There are a lot of words that already had an O sound when it was I think it was when it was a U and a before a closed syllable after a long accented vowel point, and it turned into an O. This was a very, very unique feature of Hebrew / Canaanite Phoenician. And so the O sound could be historical, and therefore it could be that the Assyrian writers, the Akkadian writers, just didn't have an O. However, while researching Akkadian inscriptions from around the 5th, 6th century, I realized that the Assyrian scribes would sometimes write a something like an a and an u side by side, because Akkadian is phonetic. What you have, it's a syllabic language. Is you create a symbol, and the symbol not only presents a letter, also represents vowel points. So you have a vocalized version. You can actually see how words were written, and in the inscriptions of Eliyahudu, some of the names like Shlomo, that actually have an o in them, there's an a o combination, which indicates that there was an attempt to try to create an O sound. Now, this is not necessarily the case about these earlier inscriptions, but they're very close to one another. We're talking about 7th century versus 6th century, and I don't think much had changed by that point. Obviously, we need to hear something from this information from someone who's an Akkadian expert. Therefore, I am promoting Nehemiah's recording that's come out. Though I don't think Nehemiah needs promoting. I need promoting. I don't think Nehemiah does. So it's quite possible that the U sound in these theophoric prefixes and suffixes is original. And what's very interesting is when you look at the pronunciation at the suffixes in Hebrew, it's an U sound as well, so Yirmiyahu. However, it became Yehoshua because of the rules of Hebrew that vowel points get changed due to different accenting. So the possible a sound that might have been a kamatz turns into a shva, which we see in Hebrew grammar in general, and the u turned into an o because it is in the area of a closed syllable, because it's Yehoshua, but it's not really closed. But it might have been Yehoshua because the Firte Patachat was actually a very late development. And it's possible that what we're looking at is someone readapting the original vowel points based on Hebrew grammar. So it's quite possible that we actually have from these Assyrian inscriptions, the Akkadian writings, that we actually have the original pronunciation, which would have been Ya in the beginning, Hu in the middle, and then probably the end ended with a Wa or a Va or something like that. So that's actually very, very, very similar to what we find the vowel points of the name of God, which appears in the Masoretic text. So it seems to be the Masoretes preserved the original pronunciation with the normal vowel point changes, or the normal vowel point phonetic changes that actually happened throughout time. So I think this really, it's very interesting to see this, and it's possible that this is actually the original pronunciation. The Masoretic text actually does have it right. It's a latter way of pronouncing the same vowel points. Because one of the things I point out to people all the time is that vowel points change, but they stay in the same spectrum. There are like these basic changes that can happen, which happen just because people speak, and vowel points change all the time. As I've mentioned many, many times before, and you can also see these on my other videos where I talk about pronunciation and vowel points, that there have been studies done that they see that vowel points are the first thing to change in a language throughout time. So it's not that someone changed something deliberately, it's just these vowel points change a little bit throughout time, and that by a certain point when someone tries to solidify everything and make everything permanent without, we're trying to record a very specific style, a very specific dialect of the language, we might end up with something a little different, but it's still very, very close. So that's my 2 cents about, if I can use the American idiom, 2 cents about the name of God. Now, what's also very interesting here is angels. A lot of people discuss the subject of angels, the appearance of angels. And what's interesting is that angels are nameless, formless. They in the beginning, the way angels appear to us is that they appear either as human beings or as some kind of manifestation. And what's very interesting here is that the angel is actually in the sneh, in the burning bush. But when the angel speaks, he speaks with authority of God. So he's actually a conductor to the voice of God, so Moses can hear God and speak with God. It's actually an angel inside the bush, but God speaks with him through the angel. So it's one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that an angel is a manifestation of the presence of God, and but there's the different ways angels are presented. But what's very interesting is later on in time, much later, more towards the Second Temple period, angels start having very specific forms. They suddenly become individuals. They have names, and so on. And this is a very intriguing thing, how angels start off as like either looking very human or appear as manifestations of different things, and then much later they appear individuals with names, and they have like these different orders. And then much later, you go to book like the book of Hanoch, the book of Enoch, that really goes into this very complex realms of angels and so on. It's a very interesting to follow. Dr. Alexander Roffe actually wrote a very interesting book about this subject. But it seems to be that in the first temple period and before that, angels would mostly appear as humans, and they would communicate with human beings in a human form, so humans can perceive what's in front of them. And it's much later that we actually hear about these really complex angels and these really unique beings. It's a very interesting thing to study. I mean, I can't really go in depth into this subject because it's a lot of material to deal with, but I highly recommend reading about it, because today the concept of angels is so big in the monotheistic religions. And I say, what it creates is this um, diversion from God Himself. These are just messengers. There's even a debate if angels really have a character of their own. That really what we're looking at is that these are extensions of the will of God. It's a very interesting subject. It's very interesting to look at. But in any case, the angel appears before Moshe and he speaks with him. And what we actually find here is a very interesting and unique saying here. And when Moshe actually asks, what would I tell them? Who sent you? He says, Ehyeh shalachani alechem. Ehyeh sent me over. And obviously, there's a whole debate about how to translate Ehyeh asher Ehyeh, if it's I am that I am, or I will be that I will be. But the main point here is that God doesn't really say His name in the first stage. He actually says, I exist and I will be. I stand to my promise. I will be there to fulfill my promise. And this is probably one of the main features that's represented, one of the main differences between the God of Israel and the other gods that were in this area, that God is faithful, that He's there, that He exists, that he's not a figment of someone's imagination, that if He makes a promise, He will stand behind His promise. The fact that He acts, that He has the ability to do things. That's one of the very unique ways that God is presented, and it's something that I think no religion in the world actually stands behind that. Not even religions that base themselves on the Tanakh really understand this. That God says, "I am there, and I will be there, and I exist, and I am loyal and faithful to my promises." And that's the thing that God stands for, and this is how He presents Himself the first time to Moses. He says. Um, he says later on, he says in like a few verses afterwards, one verse afterwards, verses chapter 3 verse 15, says Vayomer od Elohim, and Elohim said more El Moshe to Moses, Ko tomar el bnei Israel, thus you say to the children of Israel, Yud Hei Vav Elohei avotechem, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Shalachani Echem. Yud Hei Vav, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob sent me to you. So he does use his name, but he has to first of all define to Moses who he is. And what's very interesting is that really, when you look at the God of Israel, we don't know who He is. We know what He does. We know what He stands for, because we as humans cannot fathom who He is. But we can understand how He acts, what He wants from people, how He Himself responds to things. Because as I've said already in recordings about Genesis, that we are created in the image of God. It's not necessarily that God has a physical form, but we are created in a persona that imitates God. That we are to imitate God in our behavior. But one of the major differences about man and God is that God is always there and man passes away. And it says, I can't remember exactly where, I think it's Isaiah, that He is a man, He's a God and not a man, that He will make a promise and does not fail. Somewhere, I think it's somewhere in Isaiah. I can't remember exactly. Ki el velo ish, something like that, in the sense of velo chazev. There's a whole verse in which someone spoke with me about this week about this recording. Sorry, about this verse. I'm trying to paraphrase it. You can probably find it very easily if you do a search. But in any case, this is the thing that we really, when Moses says, "What is your name?" Knowing a name in the ancient world meant that you knew someone's persona. You knew someone. You knew who they were. And God says to him, "I will be," or "I am." He says, "I exist, and this is what you need to know about me." Which always brings me back to the whole the whole description in the book of Job, at the end of Job, where God says to Eov, you don't know the travel of the gazelle, and you don't know the mountains, you don't know these animals, and how do you want to know me? Things which exist in your realm, and how do you exactly want to know me? So this is kind of part of my criticism that I always put out about people who try to define God. If these are Kabbalists, or these are people who try to give us some kind of personification of God. And my response is, God has answered this question over and over again. We cannot fathom who He is, period. But what we do know is that He is there, and He will stand behind His promises, and He will fulfill everything that He promised. And God willing, we will be worthy, and He will fulfill His promises to His people, and will be redeemed very soon. So this is a very, very interesting parasha. A lot has been said about this parasha over and over again. Um, you know, it's a very interesting subject. Was Israel in Egypt? Yes, they were. There's evidence of that. Archaeologists don't want to talk about it. What is the setting of the book of Exodus? It's a very Egyptian setting. What is the setting of the name of God? A God who exists and fulfills His promises. He has His personal name. There's also obviously the classic question of that he says here, that this is my name for all times, and this is my mentioning to all generations. This is already spoke about this, the whole concept of zichri. Zecher doesn't necessarily mean to mention, to hint, like the Midrash says, oh, we can't say his name. Zecher is also to mention, which means to pronounce a name. The Midrash just is trying to justify the practice of not pronouncing the name of God. This is not what the word zecher means. Zecher is to actually mention. Zeshmi olam is a parallel to zichri. This is my name. This is how I am named. This is my mentioning. This is how you call me by my name. There's also the obvious question of what does it mean that the patriarchs didn't know him by this name. It's a complex issue that it can't be explained now on one leg, but it has to do with motifs of writing, and also maybe the idea that um, the name of God might appear in the book of Genesis, but God didn't necessarily use this name when He spoke to them. This is written after the account, after the name, the Tetragrammaton was already known to Israel. So a latter writer, Moses, who lived hundreds of years later, at least 200 to 300 years after the patriarchs, just inserted the name of God there for the latter reader, that he will know who the reference is. But it doesn't mean that they actually knew the name. There's a lot of concepts of literature that people try to ignore because it doesn't fit a certain ideology, and it's a very, very dangerous thing to do. In any case, this is what I wanted to say for this week's parasha. I've done other recordings, at least two more recordings about this weekly portion that I've done with Jeff Gilbert on Talking Torah, and I've written about this as well. There's a lot of interesting information about all these parashot, because this is a parashot that we can actually track into historical accounts as well. Unlike what some people claim, there's a lot of history here. That's Some people try to always reverse and say, oh, it's a historialization. Basically, someone made it look historical. But again, why necessarily go that direction? Maybe it's just truthful. Maybe this is really what happened. In any case, everyone have a wonderful Shabbat. I hope you enjoyed this recording. If you want to contact me on HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com, Hebrew in Israel, one word, or on the Facebook page, or unless you're viewing this through the Facebook page, through the website. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed this. If you're interested in Hebrew lessons, HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com. You can also find details of the Hebrew lessons on my website, history lessons, Bible lessons, a lot of things that I offer. In any case, Shabbat Shalom, and I hope you enjoyed it.